The letter lies alone in the center of the green felt desk, its thin paper trembling in the draft from an open window above Belgrade. Outside, the city hums with generators and trams and the quiet clatter of a country still rebuilding from war. Inside this small office in the Yugoslav capital, the air is dense with smoke and fear. Men sit along the walls on hard wooden chairs, shoes polished, uniforms pressed, hands clasped too tightly in their laps. Every eye is fixed on the man who has not moved for nearly 5 minutes. Josip Broz Tito leans forward in his leather chair, elbows on his knees, big hands folded under his chin, staring at the elegant Russian script that begins, "To Comrade Tito, from Comrade Stalin." The clock on the wall ticks loudly, each second another reminder that Moscow is waiting for an answer. The radiator hisses. A cigarette burns down unnoticed between Tito's fingers, ash lengthening dangerously before it drops onto the blotter. No one dares to speak. They have all heard the stories. What happens to people who cross Joseph Stalin is no mystery. It is the most reliable fact of the communist world. Generals vanish, party chiefs confess to impossible crimes, entire governments are remade overnight with a single nod from the Kremlin. They know this, and they know what the letter on the desk contains, an ultimatum. Obey Moscow's demands or be branded a traitor to socialism. For Tito's inner circle, the choice seems obvious. You do not defy the man who controls the Red Army, the Cominform, and the vast police machine of the Soviet state. You adjust, you retreat, you survive. That is what every other leader in Eastern Europe has done since the end of the war. But the man in the leather chair is not every other leader. He has spent years in prison under monarchies and dictatorships. He has commanded guerrillas from freezing mountain caves. He has escaped more than one death sentence already. Fear is not absent in him, but it does not rule him the way it rules others. On the side table, a silver tray holds a glass of Slavovitz. Tito has not touched it. Instead, he reaches for the letter again, smoothing it flat with the back of his hand, as if he might iron out the insults written between the lines. Stalin accuses him of nationalism, of arrogance, of deviating from Marxism-Leninism. He demands that Yugoslavia submit its economy to Soviet advisors, that Tito dismiss certain anti-Soviet ministers, that he correct his mistakes in foreign policy. Beneath the formal language sits an unspoken threat that everyone in the room can hear. Other men have received letters like this. None of them have ended well. One of Tito's closest comrades, Eduard Kardel, shifts in his chair, then forces himself still. He keeps seeing in his mind's eye the fate of the Hungarian leader Laszlo Reich, already under suspicion in Budapest, and the purges in Moscow before the war. If Stalin decides that Yugoslavia has strayed too far, what happens next is easy to imagine: secret plots, show trials, heart attacks that arrive on schedule. Kardel studies Tito's broad back and wonders with real terror whether his friend is about to lead them all into suicide. Tito knows what they are thinking. He can feel the anxiety pressing in on him from the walls, from the street outside, from Moscow itself. Obedience would be simple. A few ministers sacrificed, a few policies reversed, a public declaration of loyalty, and the storm might pass. But obedience carries its own price. It would mean the end of Yugoslavia's independence, the reduction of her hard-won country to one more satellite orbiting around Stalin's sun. It would mean telling the partisans who bled in the mountains that all their sacrifice had merely traded one master for another. The cigarette finally burns his fingers. Tito flicks the butt into an overflowing ashtray and reaches for his pen. The room tightens. This is the moment every man here has dreaded and waited for. Will he bend? Will he stall? Will he ask for some kind of face-saving compromise that keeps Moscow calm and Yugoslavia intact? Tito uncaps the pen with a single sharp movement. Then, without looking up, in the same steady tone he used to order attacks during the war, he says, "We will answer." He pulls a sheet of paper toward him, and the first words he writes are not an apology, not a plea, but a quiet declaration of independence aimed straight at the most feared man on earth. To understand why this man in a rumpled marshal's uniform can sit in Belgrade and write defiance to Joseph Stalin, you have to go back before the letter, before the victory parades, before the title of President for Life. You have to follow a metalworker's son through prisons and factories and underground cells, watch him climb through the ranks of a movement that Stalin believes he owns, and see how war gives him something no other communist in Eastern Europe possesses: power that does not come from Moscow. Decades ago, when Josip Broz is still just another worker in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there is no sign he will one day challenge the Kremlin's authority. He is born in a small Croatian village, learns a trade, and serves in the Imperial Army. The First World War takes him to the Eastern Front, where he is wounded and captured. Russian captivity exposes him to revolution. He watches an empire collapse and a new world announced in slogans and decrees. Somewhere in that chaos, the idea lodges in him that power can be overturned, that emperors fall and new orders rise. After the war, he returns not to a stable homeland, but to a new state, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, stitched together from former imperial scraps and already tearing at the seams. In workshops and cafes, he finds other men who talk about Marx and Lenin, about the October Revolution, about building something more just than the old monarchy. Joining the communist movement is not a career move, it is a path toward prison. He takes it anyway. Police raids, arrests, interrogations, long stretches behind bars follow. Each cell he occupies teaches him something that will matter later: how to keep silent under pressure, how to organize in secret, how to judge who will break and who will hold. By the 1930s, Stalin's Soviet Union exerts a cold gravitational pull over every communist party in Europe. Directives arrive from Moscow. Line changes overnight with the twists of Soviet policy. Party leaders rise or fall based on their perceived loyalty to the center. In this world, Josip Broz, now known by his underground name, Tito, begins to stand out. He is efficient, careful, survivable. While purges sweep through the ranks, he somehow avoids the fatal summons to Moscow that swallows so many of his comrades. In the shadows of Yugoslavia's cities, he rebuilds a shattered party into a disciplined machine that answers, at least on paper, to Stalin. From Stalin's viewpoint, this makes Tito useful: a strong organizer in a strategically located country, loyal to the Comintern, trained in clandestine work, exactly the sort of man who can carry the banners of Moscow's revolution further into the Balkans. But distance and experience are already shaping Tito differently from the pliant cadres elsewhere in Eastern Europe. He spends more time dodging local police than awaiting Soviet instructions. He sees the patchwork of ethnic tensions inside Yugoslavia up close and learns that slogans alone will not hold them together. He is building something that must answer to immediate realities, not just to theories written in Russian. When the Second World War arrives and Nazi Germany smashes Yugoslavia in a matter of weeks, the political map Stalin expects to control shatters again. The king flees, collaborators take power, and occupying forces carve the country into brutal zones. Fascist puppets begin massacring Serbs, Jews, Roma, and political enemies. At first, the Kremlin's strategy in the region is cautious, even passive, more concerned with its own treaty lines than with uprisings in the Balkans. But on the ground, far from Moscow, Tito sees something different: an opportunity to turn national catastrophe into revolutionary war. In the mountains and forests of Bosnia and Croatia, he organizes scattered fighters into a partisan army that gradually becomes a state within a state. Villages under partisan control collect taxes, run courts, even set up schools. Peasants who have never heard of Marx decide they're on Tito's side because his men are the only ones fighting both occupiers and local fascists. Each successful ambush, each liberated town adds to a reservoir of legitimacy that comes not from Soviet guns, but from Yugoslav blood. While other communist leaders in Eastern Europe wait for the Red Army to free their countries, Tito's authority grows out of battles he commands himself. In Moscow, Stalin watches this with a mixture of interest and unease. A strong communist movement in Yugoslavia is desirable. A strong communist leader who does not owe his survival to Soviet troops is something else entirely. The relationship that emerges during the war is already tinged with suspicion. Stalin offers recognition and some aid, but he never fully trusts this partisan marshal, whose reports sometimes sound more like those of a head of state than of a subordinate party secretary. Tito accepts Soviet support, but he never allows Soviet officers to take over his command. Each man is already measuring the other, sensing a future confrontation that neither can yet fully define. As the war grinds on and tides turn against the Axis, that future draws closer. Tito's partisans, now recognized as the primary resistance force in Yugoslavia, liberate city after city. By the time the Red Army approaches the borders, most of the country is already under partisan control. Stalin cannot ignore this. He invites Tito to Moscow, welcomes him with honors, praises his courage. The photographs from those meetings show two men smiling, raising glasses, embracing like comrades. But behind the smiles lies a basic question that will not go away. In the new socialist world being built from the ruins of Europe, who answers to whom, and how far will either man go to enforce his answer? When Tito returns from Moscow, he carries medals on his chest and new titles in his pocket, but also a clearer sense of how small Yugoslavia appears on Stalin's mental map of Europe. In private conversations, the Soviet leader speaks of our Balkans, our frontiers, our future wars. Yugoslavia to him is not a partner, but a piece. Tito listens, nods, drinks toasts, and files every phrase away. He has just spent 4 years fighting to keep foreign armies from deciding his country's fate. The idea of simply handing that power over to a different foreign capital does not sit well, no matter how many red flags fly over its buildings. The war ends in Europe with parades, speeches, and hurried border negotiations. Yugoslavia is wrecked, cities flattened, villages burned, families shattered. Yet in the ruins, something rare has emerged, a communist government that took power largely by its own effort. There is no Red Army garrison in Belgrade, no Soviet military administration in charge of ration cards and arrests. Tito's regime owes Moscow ideological allegiance and some wartime assistance, but not its very existence. That distinction, invisible to many outside observers, is everything to the man now called Marshal Tito. It is the difference between being a local manager of someone else's empire and being the architect of his own.
In the first months of peace, the partnership seems workable enough. Yugoslav and Soviet delegations shuttle back and forth. Treaties are signed. Economists talk of integration. Propaganda posters show Yugoslav workers shaking hands with Soviet comrades, two nations marching together into a bright socialist future. On paper, the arrangement looks like what Stalin wants across all of Eastern Europe, fraternal states aligned under his strategic direction. But beneath the slogans, frictions multiply. Yugoslavia's leaders, hardened by years of guerrilla autonomy, are not inclined to ask permission for every move. The first big cracks appear over the question of the Balkans themselves. Tito's vision of post-war Yugoslavia is expansive. He imagines a federation that might one day include Albania, perhaps even Bulgaria, creating a bloc of South Slavic and neighboring states bound together under a kind of Yugoslav leadership. He sends advisors, weapons, and money to nearby communist movements, especially to the guerrillas fighting in the Greek Civil War. In his mind, he's simply extending the partisan struggle across borders, helping comrades against reactionary forces. In Stalin's mind, he's acting like an independent strategist in a theater the Kremlin considers its own. Messages from Moscow grow sharper. Stalin reminds Tito that foreign policy is not a playground for experiments, that premature revolutions can provoke the Western allies and jeopardize broader Soviet plans. He insists that Yugoslavia reduce its support for Greek partisans, coordinate every diplomatic step with the Soviet Foreign Ministry, and place its economic planning under closer Soviet guidance. Between the lines, the message is simple. There is room for initiative, but only within boundaries drawn in Moscow. Tito reads these admonitions and feels the old instinct of a field commander rising. Do not let distant politicians dictate your battle when you know the terrain better than they ever will. Inside Yugoslavia, the mood is no less complicated. The new government is rebuilding railways, collectivizing land, nationalizing factories. Secret police agencies hunt former collaborators and real or imagined enemies. Yet across the hills and factories, ordinary people notice something different from the rest of the Eastern Bloc. There are Soviet advisors, yes, but the uniforms on the streets are Yugoslav. The speeches from balconies come from men who fought beside them, not from figures flown in from Moscow. That sense of homegrown authority feeds Tito's confidence. Each successful 5-year plan target met, each dam opened, each factory inaugurated, seems to confirm that his country can stand on its own socialist feet. Stalin, watching from the Kremlin, grows less reassured with each Yugoslav success. Independent prestige in a satellite is dangerous. It breeds ideas in other capitals. If Belgrade can chart its own path, why not Warsaw or Prague? Increasingly, reports reach him about Tito's popularity, his tours through factories where workers cheer him like a king, his ease among foreign journalists who describe him as charismatic and unshakable. Those same reports mention something else, a strain of nationalism in the Yugoslav leadership, a pride in being distinct from, not merely part of, the Soviet model. For a man who spent decades eliminating any hint of deviation, these are warning lights. The warnings soon turn into direct confrontation. Letters begin to arrive in Belgrade, each written in the stiff, formal tone of Moscow's highest office. They criticize economic errors, condemn the cult of the leader around Tito, and accuse certain Yugoslav officials of plotting against the Soviet Union. The phrasing is careful, but anyone familiar with Stalin's history understands the prelude when they see it. Criticism leads to investigation, investigation leads to confession, confession leads to removal. Somewhere in the labyrinth of the Kremlin, men are already compiling lists of names. Tito gathers his inner circle to read each letter aloud. The reactions vary. Some comrades counsel caution, arguing that misunderstanding can be smoothed over by diplomatic language and symbolic gestures. Others suggest quiet purges of a few officials to satisfy Moscow's hunger for scapegoats. A few more anxious whisper about what happened to those who fell afoul of Stalin in the 1930s, loyal revolutionaries shot in basements after televised confessions. Tito listens, weighing not only the words in the letters, but the fear in his comrades' eyes. He understands that fear. He also understands how it can be used against them. The easiest course, the only one every other leader in the Soviet orbit will eventually choose, is submission and public apology, a resolution at the party congress acknowledging Yugoslav errors, a reshuffle of the cabinet to remove the names circled in red in Moscow, then a smiling photograph with Stalin in the Kremlin, proof that quarrels among brothers have been resolved. It is the script already being rehearsed in other capitals. Yet each time Tito reads through that imaginary performance, he sees not reconciliation, but shackles. Once he accepts that script, there will be no second chance to refuse.
The argument is not only about pride, it is also about survival. Tito knows that partial submission rarely satisfies dictators. If he gives in today on foreign policy, tomorrow it will be on domestic appointments, then on army command, then on who runs the security services. Piece by piece, the independent base of power he built through war and reconstruction would be dismantled and replaced with people whose first loyalty is to Moscow. He would become what so many other leaders have become: expendable, removable, one more face in a long line of men who believed their revolutionary credentials would protect them and discovered too late that they did not. In early 1948, the standoff hardens. Stalin summons Yugoslav representatives to Moscow and scolds them like misbehaving pupils. Reports of the meetings speak of raised voices, of ashtrays overflowing as cigarettes burn down between clenched fingers, of Yugoslav officials realizing that they are not so much allies as suspects. Back in Belgrade, Tito receives updated intelligence from his security chief. Soviet agents are stepping up their activities inside Yugoslavia. There are rumors of plots, of networks being built within the army, of assassination plans whispered in code. The confrontation is no longer just ideological, it is becoming dangerously physical. All of this pressure funnels into the moment we saw at the beginning: the letter on the desk, the silent room, the ticking clock. What makes that night in 1948 decisive is not that Stalin is threatening him. That has been clear for months. It is that Tito understands, with a clarity sharpened by years of imprisonment and warfare, that there will be no safe middle ground. Either Yugoslavia bends fully, becoming a satellite that lives or dies at the Kremlin's whim, or it draws a line that even Stalin cannot cross without risking open conflict. The choice is brutal, but it is at least simple. And once Tito's mind settles on the latter, other questions arise. If we refuse, will our army stay loyal? Will our people accept isolation? Will the West see us as enemies or potential partners? When his reply finally goes back to Moscow, it is couched in polite language, but unmistakable in its message. Yugoslavia rejects the accusations of treason and deviation. It insists on the right to pursue socialism in its own way. It will not allow foreign advisors to run its ministries or its security services. Between the lines, the subtext lands like a slap: "We are not your province." The audacity of such a letter, from a small Balkan state to the man who controls half of Europe, is staggering. In the Kremlin, Stalin reads it and, according to accounts from those who knew his temper, grows uncharacteristically quiet. Then he begins to plan his response. That response arrives in June 1948 in the form of a collective decision from the Cominform, the organization meant to coordinate communist parties across Europe. In a storm of rhetoric, the resolution denounces the Yugoslav leadership as enemies of socialism, accuses them of nationalism, secrecy, and betrayal, and calls on healthy forces within the Yugoslav party to remove Tito and his circle. In practical terms, Yugoslavia has just been excommunicated from the Church of International Communism. Overnight, an ally becomes a pariah. The message to Yugoslav communists is clear: you can have Tito or you can have Stalin, but not both. Across Eastern Europe, party newspapers obediently reprint the Cominform resolution. Leaders in Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, Sofia, and Bucharest rush to declare their agreement. They distance themselves from Belgrade, eager to prove their loyalty to Moscow. None of them consider following Yugoslavia's example. They depend too completely on Soviet troops and subsidies, too deeply on the personal approval of the man in the Kremlin. For them, Tito's defiance looks less like courage and more like madness. In their calculations, no one walks away from Stalin and survives. Inside Yugoslavia, the effect is explosive. Suddenly, every party meeting, every army barracks, every factory cell becomes a potential battlefield of loyalties. Agents loyal to Moscow whisper that Tito has betrayed socialism, that Stalin will return order if only the right men take charge. Tito's security services swing into action, arresting suspected conspirators, watching for signs of a coup. The tiny socialist state now finds itself surrounded by hostile neighbors and targeted from within by the powerful movement it once considered its family. Whether its leader can hold all these fraying threads together becomes a question not just of politics, but of survival. The danger is personal as well as political. Accounts from the period speak of multiple Soviet plots to eliminate Tito physically, from infiltrating assassins to encouraging internal rivals. Later, in one of his more sardonic remarks to foreign visitors, Tito will claim to have received letters from Stalin that read like death warrants, and to have replied with a simple warning: "If you send one more assassin, I will send one to Moscow, and I won't need to send another." Whether the wording is exact or embellished, the attitude behind it is genuine. He is not bluffing on his willingness to meet threat with threat. Exiled from the Cominform, cut off from Soviet aid, and menaced by neighboring regimes, Yugoslavia turns to the one place Marxist orthodoxy it should not, the capitalist West. Diplomats in Belgrade and Washington, London and Paris begin quiet conversations. At first, there is mutual suspicion. Western leaders still remember Tito's wartime communist rhetoric and his purges of opponents at home. But they also see a strategic opening. If this small socialist state can be kept alive outside Moscow's orbit, it may weaken Stalin's hold over the region. Aid packages, loans, and grain shipments begin to flow, not as acts of friendship, but as moves in a larger game.
For Tito, accepting Western assistance without surrendering his revolutionary image is a delicate dance. At rallies, he denounces imperialism. In closed rooms, he bargains for credits and machinery. The balancing act becomes a defining feature of his rule. At home, he doubles down on one-party control, arresting those who side too openly with Moscow and those who flirt with liberal opposition. Abroad, he cultivates an image of principled independence, a man who will take help from East or West, but bow to neither. The contrast is sharp, a system that mixes genuine autonomy with hard repression. This new posture carries its own risks. Hardliners in the Yugoslav party worry that Western influence will corrupt socialism from within, while former Moscow loyalists nurse grudges in prison camps and remote labor colonies. In neighboring capitals, propagandists portray Tito as a traitor, a fascist in disguise, a dictator fattened on American grain. Yet each year that passes without a Soviet invasion, each harvest that avoids famine thanks to foreign shipments, strengthens the perception that his bet on independence was not suicidal after all. In city squares and village taverns, ordinary Yugoslavs contrast their relative freedom to travel and to hear foreign radio with the tighter controls in the rest of the bloc. As the 1950s unfold, Tito begins to project this independence beyond Europe. He travels to India, Egypt, and other newly decolonized nations, speaking not as a client of either superpower, but as the leader of a country that chose its own path. The idea of non-alignment takes shape, a loose grouping of states that seek distance from both Washington and Moscow. Conferences are held, communiques issued, handshakes photographed. For many leaders emerging from colonial rule, Tito's story is appealing. A man who fought occupiers, built socialism, defied a domineering ally, and survived. In those conversations, the night he answered Stalin's letter becomes more than a Balkan drama. It becomes a model of how small states might navigate a world carved up by giants. Yet even as his international reputation grows, the contradictions of his system deepen. At home, political dissent is not tolerated. Camps like Goli Otok fill with those accused of being Cominformists, alleged supporters of Moscow, many of them imprisoned on flimsy evidence or personal vendettas. Economic experiments in worker self-management bring both innovation and chaos. Ethnic tensions, long suppressed by the shared pride of wartime resistance and post-war reconstruction, simmer beneath the surface. The man who refused to bow abroad expects and enforces a deep bowing at home. Still, in the shadow world of Cold War intelligence services, Tito's continued survival stands out.
One by one, other communist leaders who showed hints of independence fall or are pulled back into line. When Hungarian reformer Imre Nagy attempts to steer a bolder course in 1956, Soviet tanks crush his revolution and a firing squad ends his life. When Czechoslovakia's Alexander Dubček proposes socialism with human face in 1968, Warsaw Pact forces roll into Prague and drag him away. In both crises, Yugoslavia watches nervously from the sidelines. The message from Moscow to any would-be Tito imitators is unmistakable. There will be no other. That there is even one is a product of timing, geography, and character. Tito's partisans had liberated much of Yugoslavia themselves, making a large-scale Soviet intervention costly and uncertain. The rugged terrain and battle-hardened army promised a long, bloody guerrilla war if Moscow tried. Western powers, eager to exploit the split in the socialist camp, signaled they would not be indifferent to a Soviet invasion on the Adriatic. And above all, Tito himself refused every invitation, threat, and inducement to step aside. Each time the system wobbled, he leaned into his role as the man who once told Stalin no and lived to govern the consequences. By the late 1960s, the image of Tito as the man who slipped Stalin's grasp has hardened into legend, both at home and abroad. In Belgrade, his portrait hangs in factories and schools, not just as a symbol of socialism, but as an emblem of Yugoslav stubbornness. On visits to foreign capitals, he is greeted with a kind of wary respect. Western leaders see him as a crack in the Iron Curtain. Leaders in the developing world see him as proof that it is possible to stand between rather than beneath the superpowers. Every handshake, every state dinner, every non-aligned summit quietly reinforces a narrative that began with a single refused submission. This is the communist who got away. None of this means his grip at home is easy. Governing Yugoslavia is like balancing a tray of crystal glasses on rough terrain. 6 republics, 2 autonomous provinces, multiple languages, and deep historical grievances all coexist under the same red star. During his tours, Tito reads the mood in each region with a veteran's eye. In Croatia, he hears murmurs of greater autonomy. In Kosovo, Albanian slogans and counter-slogans. In Serbia, resentment over perceived slights. He responds with a mixture of concessions, slogans about brotherhood and unity, and the occasional hard knock from the security services. The country stays together, but often through the sheer force of his personal presence. That presence becomes almost theatrical. Tito travels by special train and yacht, accompanied by an entourage and a carefully curated image, the white marshal's uniform, the pipe, the easy smile with foreign stars and movie actors. To some Yugoslavs, especially the young and politically skeptical, this begins to look like the very cult of personality they were once accused of in Moscow. To others, it is simply the price of stability in a region with too much history and too many fault lines. Whatever they think of the man, they know one thing. When he appears on the balcony or on the newsreel screen, their country still exists as something more than someone else's province.
In Moscow, leaders come and go after Stalin's death. Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and others, but none forget the Yugoslav precedent. Each has to decide how to handle this outlier on their southern flank. There are phases of thaw, visits filled with smiles, new economic treaties, and shared rhetoric against imperialism. Yet each time, beneath the surface, both sides remember 1948. The Soviet Union never regains the authority it once claimed over Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia never forgets that the tanks which rolled into Budapest and Prague could, in a different calculation, have rolled toward Belgrade. Their relationship becomes a long, cautious dance between memory and expediency. As the 1970s arrive, Tito is an old man, but one still capable of commanding a room. His speeches are slower, his step heavier, yet his reputation continues to grow in distant capitals. In 1979, he hosts another non-aligned summit, greeting leaders from Asia, Africa, and Latin America who have built their own states in the shadow of empires. Many of them know what it means to receive ultimatums from bigger powers. When they shake his hand, they are shaking the hand of someone who once pushed one back across the table.
The story of that push, embellished, simplified, retold in a dozen languages, has become part of their shared political folklore. But time is doing what no foreign pressure could. The institutions of Yugoslavia, designed around his central role, strain as questions about succession grow louder. Who comes after the man who held the contradictions together? Committees and rotating presidencies are created on paper, but everyone understands that none of his likely successors carry his unique combination of partisan legend, international stature, and ruthless authority. In smoky party meetings, older comrades whisper their worries. Can the system that defied Stalin survive without the man who made that defiance? Or has his success, paradoxically, postponed the deeper reforms and compromises the Federation will need when he is gone? In May 1980, after a long illness, Josip Broz Tito dies in a hospital in Ljubljana. The funeral that follows is one of the largest gatherings of world leaders in the Cold War era. Presidents, princes, dictators, and prime ministers file past his coffin draped in the Yugoslav flag. For a few days, television screens around the world fill with images of a country that looks solid, a man whose life seems to trace a clean line from worker to marshal to global statesman. Yet those who know the internal tensions feel a chill beneath the ceremony. The unspoken question hanging over the grave is not just how to remember him, but what will happen now that the living symbol of Yugoslavia's independent path is no longer there to enforce it. In the decade that follows, the cracks he managed to plaster over begin to widen. Economic troubles, ethnic nationalism, and power struggles among Republican leaders grow more intense. By the early 1990s, long after Stalin's death and the collapse of the Soviet Union itself, Yugoslavia descends into the very nightmare of fragmentation and war that Tito spent his life trying to prevent. For viewers looking back, there is a bitter irony in the timing. The man who refused to let his country be carved up by outside empires could not, even with all his force of will, inoculate it forever against tearing itself apart from within. And yet, even amid the violence that follows, his defiance of Stalin retains a strange, stubborn meaning. It is not erased by later failures. Instead, it stands as a moment when, in a world divided between two armored camps, a small state refused the logic of obedience. It did not become a liberal democracy. It did not escape its own crimes or blind spots. But it did, for a crucial stretch of history, prove that the map of the Cold War was not quite as simple as two colors locked in place. There was, however briefly and imperfectly, a space in between, and that space was carved out by a decision made over a single piece of paper in 1948. Which brings us back to the office in Belgrade, to the smoke-filled room and the thin letter on the desk. If you could stand in the doorway of that night and somehow tell the men inside what their choice would set in motion, they might not believe you. You would explain that their refusal would earn them exile from the communist family, then grain from the Americans, that it would make their leader a hero in distant cities even as he built prison camps on a rocky Adriatic island, that it would help inspire movements for independence on 3 continents, and that the country they were trying to protect would one day vanish in fire and siege. The paradox would sound too heavy to fit into one decision, into one man's penstroke. Tito, if he could hear such a prophecy, might shrug in that way people who have gambled their lives too many times often do. For him, the equation that night is simpler, almost brutally so. He remembers cells and execution squads, the comrades who disappeared in Moscow's purges, the villages in Yugoslavia that chose his partisans because no one else came to fight for them. He looks at the signatures on Stalin's letter and understands that obedience now would mean re-entering a world where others decide which of his comrades lives and which dies. Whatever the future cost, that is one line he will not cross again. In the end, what makes his refusal extraordinary is not that it sprang from pure virtue or perfect foresight. It did not. It rose from pride, from calculation, from belief in his own reading of power, from a genuine conviction that Yugoslav socialism must answer first to Yugoslav realities. Great acts in history are rarely clean. They are mixtures of courage and ego, of idealism and self-preservation. Tito's defiance of Stalin is one of those mixtures. It is both a stand against domination and a shrewd move by a man determined to keep his own throne. For viewers watching the grainy footage of parades and conferences, for listeners hearing the story decades later, that complexity is easy to miss. The temptation is to flatten the characters, to turn Stalin into a simple monster and Tito into a flawless rebel. But if you listen closely to the echoes of that night in 1948, you hear something subtler. You hear a dictator who cannot abide a rival center of loyalty, even in a distant mountain country. You hear another dictator who, unlike his peers, has enough independent power to say no and enough will to accept the risk. Their collision does not produce a fairy tale hero, but it does produce a rare crack in an otherwise rigid system. Wars, revolutions, and cold standoffs are often described as contests between ideologies, between economic systems or blocks of states. Yet moments like the writing of that letter remind us that they are also, stubbornly, contests between individuals with particular histories and stubbornnesses. If someone other than Tito had led Yugoslavia's partisans, if someone less suspicious of Moscow's control had emerged from the war, the story of Eastern Europe might have run along smoother, more predictable lines. A whole branch of the Cold War's crooked tree begins at the point where one man decides that shared doctrine is not the same as shared obedience. Somewhere in the archives of more than one intelligence service lies the paper trail of that defiance, the original Cominform resolution, reports on failed assassination plots, cables about emergency grain shipments, transcripts of non-aligned conferences. To scholars, they are sources. To the people who lived through them, they were weather, storms that shaped their daily lives. But beneath those layers sits the quiet scene we began with, a desk, a letter, a man pausing before he writes. History often turns not on speeches in vast halls, but on silences in small rooms. On that night in Belgrade, after Tito signs his response and the typist set to work, the men in the office begin to breathe again. Some feel relief, others feel dread. None of them know exactly what they have just set in motion. Outside, the city's lights burn against a dark sky. Trams rattle, couples argue, children sleep. The world does not change shape yet, but in the invisible network of decisions and fears that binds capitals together, a new line has just been drawn. One side belongs to those who bow to the center without question. On the other side stand a handful of people in a small Balkan state who, for better or worse, have chosen not to.